The air was dense with silence, tense, almost reverent, as producers murmured into headsets and journalists sat poised with notebooks open, pens hovering. The seal of the United States Congress loomed behind the microphone, a reminder that this was not just another press update. Jasmine Crockett, congresswoman and rising political firebrand, was minutes from stepping out to deliver a major policy proposal, one focused on rebuilding public infrastructure and expanding access to basic services in neglected low-income communities. Whispers had circulated for days that this plan would be both ambitious and politically explosive, a direct challenge to the silent inertia of Washington's elite. Some reporters had come for answers. Others came to circle her like vultures. She knew the room wasn't filled with allies. It was filled with professional sharks trained to detect even a drop of political blood. And somewhere behind the poised cameras and sterilized questions, injustice waited to twist her words into weapons. She was about to step into a space where fairness was a luxury and survival demanded precision. Then the atmosphere shifted. The door near the side aisle opened with a soft mechanical hiss, and a presence swept into the room like a cold draft. Caitlin Collins entered. Her reputation preceded her, the CNN anchor who had rattled the Trump White House and dissected DeSantis with surgical on-air pressure. She wasn't just a reporter, she was a force. Eyes turned as she walked with deliberate grace down the center aisle, heels clicking against the linoleum like a metronome of confrontation. She wore a slate gray jacket, tailored and sharp, her press badge slung like a blade at her side. She took a front row seat without looking left or right, opened a notebook with one fluid motion, and tapped her pen twice, once to steady herself and once to signal, "I'm not here to observe. I'm here to challenge." The entire room shifted with her. Jasmine hadn't spoken a single word yet, but already the battlefield had been marked. And then, with the storm seated in the front row and the cameras humming like engines at the ready, Jasmine Crockett stepped through the curtain, straight into the lion's den, carrying nothing but facts and fire. The room reacted not with applause, not with murmurs, but with silence sharp enough to draw blood. Jasmine Crockett walked straight to the podium, her heels muted against the carpeted floor, her back unflinching beneath the weight of 18 lenses trained on every muscle of her face. She didn't smile. This wasn't a campaign rally. It was a battlefield where narratives were ammunition, and the wrong word could detonate hours of planning. She adjusted the microphone with a single movement, her fingers steady, her breathing measured. Then, with the confidence of someone who had done this before, who had bled through this before, she began. "Let's speak in numbers, not noise," she said. "In the first quarter of this year, we reduced food insecurity in vulnerable zip codes by 18.6%. That's not theory. That's dinner on the table for 1.2 million Americans." A beat passed. Uninsured ER visits dropped by 9.3% in districts receiving targeted subsidies. And for the first time since 2004, small business loan approvals in high-risk census tracts rose above the national average. She didn't blink. Behind her, a screen flickered to life. Clean bar graphs, verified sources, Bureau of Labor Statistics. This wasn't fluff. This was federal steel, presented with surgical calm. The numbers didn't beg for applause. They dared the room to deny them. Jasmine wasn't asking for faith. She was demanding acknowledgement. For a moment, the energy in the room shifted, even softened. A few reporters scribbled notes with actual interest. One camera operator whispered to another. She came loaded, but Jasmine wasn't there for validation. She was there to draw a line between what had been neglected and what had been done. This wasn't a woman selling dreams. This was a woman measuring impact in decimal points. NBC's correspondent was the first to break the stillness. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, cautiously respectful, "can you speak to how federal oversight will prevent fraud in the grant expansion model?" Jasmine met his eyes and answered with the precision of a prosecutor. "Oversight is already layered into the funding pipeline," she said. "3 checkpoints: Treasury, GAO, and local compliance audits. The fraud risk model flagged less than 0.3% deviation last quarter. That's not a promise. That's a verified metric." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The authority was in her composure. Heads nodded. Not agreement, respect. and that, in a room like this, was harder to earn. Next came a policy wonk from Politico, glasses tilted, posture skeptical. And what about the housing angle? How soon before residents feel the effect? Jasmine didn't pause. Two-phase implementation, she replied. Infrastructure breakouts begin August, tenant impact projected by January. Section 8 reform will be submitted to the committee by October. The room stilled again. No one had expected her to arrive this sharp. She wasn't dodging, she wasn't spinning, she was delivering. And for a flicker of time, a heartbeat no more, Jasmine Crockett owned that room. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was coiled, like a wire pulled taut beneath the floor, waiting to snap. From the front row, Caitlin Collins raised her hand. Not fast, not loud, but slow, surgical. Her fingers moved with the calm deliberation of someone who already knew what she would ask and what it would cause. Conversations halted mid-whisper. Pens froze mid-word. NBC's reporter glanced sideways. The camera angles shifted. Even the sound techs looked up. Because when Caitlin Collins raised her hand, it didn't mean a question was coming. It meant the air was about to get thinner. Jasmine saw it too. She saw the gleam in Caitlin's eyes. The poise of a woman not here for truth, but for impact. And in that single breathless moment, Jasmine Crockett understood. The press conference was over. The showdown had just begun. And then, like a rifle shot across the calm, Caitlin Collins spoke. Not as a journalist seeking answers, but as a tactician launching the first strike in a war of narratives. Congresswoman Crockett, Caitlin said, her voice slicing cleanly through the thick air like the edge of a prosecutor's brief. Based on the administration's latest expenditure records and the Department of Health Service Access Index, would you concede that your policy, despite your stated intentions, is exacerbating inequality between districts? Her words weren't fast, but they were loaded, delivered with surgical control, each syllable designed to undermine, not inquire. She didn't blink. Her pen tapped once against her pad, not taking notes, only marking her territory. The room tensed. Even veteran reporters from the Washington Post straightened in their seats. It wasn't the content of the question that hit, it was the trap buried beneath it. Agree, and Jasmine would be admitting policy failure. Disagree, and she'd be painted as blind to the suffering of the very people she claimed to protect. The air was no longer just thick, it was suffocating, pressed in by invisible expectations and silent verdicts. Caitlin hadn't asked for data. She had demanded a confession. And every camera in the room was rolling, waiting to catch the sound of a woman being politically crucified. Jasmine Crockett stood still, not frozen, but rooted, as if the floor beneath her belonged to her and no one else. Her eyes didn't flinch toward the staffers on the sideline or the talking points clipped inside her binder. She met Caitlin's gaze head-on. The silence that followed wasn't fear, it was control. Then she answered slowly, like each word had been chosen days ago. There is no such thing as a flawless policy, she began, her tone firm but restrained. But what I offer is something this building has lacked for decades: accountable leadership and visible course correction. She let that sit, unmoving. Her voice deepened, not louder but heavier, like weight dropping into the room. You want to talk about disparities? Fine. Let's talk. Let's talk about South Dallas, where maternal mortality rates doubled in the 10 years before this policy ever existed. Or about Ward 7 in D.C., where asthma hospitalization rates in Black children were 4 times the national average while federal funds sat frozen under previous administrations. She leaned in slightly, her hand flat on the podium. This policy didn't invent those gaps. It's the first plan that put them under a national microscope. And if discomfort comes from that, good. That means it's working. Reporters stopped writing. One of the younger ones visibly gulped. Caitlin's pen stopped tapping. Jasmine hadn't deflected. She had redirected, weaponizing the very history they tried to use against her. No anger, no panic, just sharpened resolve, facts like daggers, and a voice trained not to shout, but to cut through the noise with surgical precision. For that moment, no one moved. Not because they agreed with her, but because they felt the floor shift. The silence hadn't even settled before Caitlin pounced again. This time not with a question, but with a demand laced in accusation, as though the floor beneath Jasmine's credibility was already cracking, and Caitlin had come to deliver the final blow. "I'm not asking for a commitment," Caitlin said, her voice harder now, the polished edge of professionalism peeling back to reveal something colder, more calculated. "I'm asking whether you're denying the reality that the data itself reveals." Her words fell like iron in the room, deliberate, heavy, undeniable. There was no nuance in her tone, no invitation to dialogue. It was a verdict disguised as a question, framed not to elicit truth, but to corner her prey. Caitlin didn't blink. She leaned slightly forward, just enough to show she wasn't simply curious. She was daring Jasmine to flinch. A few reporters shifted uncomfortably, not because they disagreed, but because they recognized the shift. This was no longer journalism. This was a confrontation staged for maximum exposure, where the facts weren't weapons, but props for the real performance. And Jasmine Crockett was the target, trapped between optics and obligation, asked to defend not just a policy, but her integrity, her intellect, her presence in that room. But she didn't move. She didn't look away. And when she finally spoke, it was not with defense, but with devastating clarity. "No," Jasmine said, her voice low but unshakable. "I'm not denying the data. What I am denying is the distortion of it to fit a storyline that was written long before I opened my mouth." She took a breath, not because she was out of control, but because she understood the magnitude of what she was about to say. "You're not interested in the root causes, Caitlin. You're interested in the moment. The moment where I look unsure, where I say something you can loop on prime time under a headline that strips away every ounce of context." Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in precision. "I will not answer a loaded question as if it's neutral. I will not validate a trap by pretending it's a bridge." The room tightened again. Someone exhaled audibly. And for that one suspended moment, it was no longer Jasmine who was under scrutiny. It was the question itself. The premise had fractured, and in that fracture, she stood, not as a subject, but as a challenger. Jasmine's answer had landed like a controlled explosion, measured but undeniable. And instead of settling the tension, it pulled the oxygen out of the room, drawing every lens, every pen, every eye to the widening fault line between control and collapse. In a single breath, the room turned electric. Cameramen from MSNBC and C-SPAN, who had maintained wide establishing shots for the first 20 minutes, now began repositioning with urgency. The soft whir of motors echoed faintly as their rigs adjusted, telescoping inward toward the epicenter. Caitlin Collins, rigid and relentless in the front row, and Jasmine Crockett, steady as a wire pulled tight but unbroken. Focus rings turned, boom mics lowered, inching into the invisible space between the two women, like spears dropped into an arena. Behind them, producers gave silent hand gestures. Zoom in, stay tight, watch her eyes, because they knew. This was no longer about a bill, or oversight, or policy timelines. This was spectacle, a gladiator match dressed in civics. The image of Jasmine standing unyielding under pressure from one of the most influential journalists in the country was visual gold. Every second that passed without a stumble made it more valuable. And yet, the longer it went on, the more obvious the imbalance became. This wasn't a dialogue. It was a provocation disguised as professionalism. Scattered whispers rippled through the rows like a rising wind before a storm. Pages stopped turning. Tablets went dark. Reporters stopped writing not out of respect, but because they were now watching history trying not to bleed. One young intern leaned toward her senior editor and whispered, "Is this still Q&A protocol?" The editor didn't respond. He just stared, jaw locked, as if waiting for the floor to cave. And then came the low voice, graveled and tired, from a veteran Associated Press correspondent seated near the third row. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't lift his eyes, but his words slid out into the silence with the weight of experience. "This isn't a question anymore. This is an interrogation." And no one disagreed, because everyone could feel it. The rules had shifted. What had started as a briefing had curdled into something colder, sharper. Jasmine wasn't just defending a policy anymore. She was defending the right to finish a sentence without being carved apart in real time. As the AP reporter's words lingered in the stale air, "This is an interrogation." Jasmine made a subtle shift, not in posture, but in presence. She wasn't backing down. She was about to reassert what the room had forgotten. This wasn't her trial. It was her platform. "If there are any questions regarding the policy at hand," Jasmine began, voice measured, syllables controlled, the very embodiment of disciplined grace under fire. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. Her tone was like glass, clear, hard, and razor thin. But the moment the words left her lips, Caitlin Collins pounced, cutting in like a serrated edge. "So you're refusing to answer the question? You're dodging it?" Caitlin's voice had shifted. Gone was the veneer of neutral inquiry, replaced now with something more aggressive, performative. The line wasn't a follow-up. It was an indictment disguised as indignation. Several reporters audibly inhaled, pens poised midair. Even the camera operators adjusted their lenses, zooming closer on Jasmine's face, hoping to catch a twitch, a sigh, anything they could interpret as unraveling. The trap had been laid with surgical timing. Either defend and appear combative, or stay silent and look evasive. And yet Jasmine did neither. She turned her head, not toward Caitlin, but toward the cluster of red recording lights just beyond the podium. She found the lens, and she locked in. Her expression didn't harden, it clarified, like a signal sharpening in static. "I'm not here to perform submission," she said calmly, her voice deepening by a fraction. "And I'm not here to dance for viral clips." Then after a perfectly weighted pause, she added, "I came here to engage in a democratic conversation. If that isn't the goal, then this isn't journalism. It's stagecraft." The final word hung in the air like a blade suspended above a wire. Caitlin didn't respond. Not because she couldn't, but because Jasmine had redirected the entire battlefield. She hadn't dodged. She had exposed the game itself. And in that instant, the room felt different. Not because power had changed hands, but because Jasmine Crockett had reminded everyone watching that power wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was surgical. Sometimes it was quiet. And sometimes it stared directly into the camera and rewrote the rules in real time. But just when Jasmine's command of the room seemed unshakable, when the rhythm of her voice had pierced through hostility and reframed the moment, Caitlin Collins made her move, not with words alone, but with something far more dangerous. Premeditated weaponry disguised as journalism. Caitlin didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her confidence had calcified into something cold and sharp, and now she unsheathed it like a dagger polished behind closed doors. With a single motion, she lifted a folded document from her lap, meticulously prepared, its creases still crisp, its timing painfully perfect. The movement was theatrical without seeming dramatic, designed for the cameras, calculated to detonate. "Congresswoman," she said, voice controlled, eyes gleaming like the hunter who finally saw her opening. "This is an internal memorandum from the Office of Grant Equity, dated just 22 days ago." She turned the paper slightly so the cameras behind her could catch the header. "It outlines a 42% shortfall in targeted funding for 3 majority black districts: South Memphis, East Cleveland, and Ward 8 in D.C., under your signature policy initiative." She let the words linger like the final lines of a closing argument, then added with a precision that only experience and intent could engineer. "You've said this policy is inclusive, restorative, and data-driven. But this document, this evidence, says the opposite. So how do you reconcile that? How do you explain a funding structure that appears to reinforce the very disparities it claims to fix?" The air in the room didn't just thicken, it warped. The cameras leaned in, the reporters stilled, and even the fluorescent lights seemed colder. This wasn't a follow-up. This wasn't organic. This was a trap engineered in a newsroom days ago, timed to the moment Jasmine appeared at her most confident. The numbers were real. The memo was real. But Jasmine could see it in Caitlin's eyes. This wasn't about fixing injustice. It was about framing it. And not for the record, but for the replay. For the briefest moment, barely a breath, Jasmine didn't respond. She stood at the podium, hands still, gaze locked on the paper now held up like a courtroom exhibit. Her pulse didn't spike, her voice didn't crack, but beneath the steel of her public armor, a familiar fury stirred. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that builds. The kind that has learned to wait until the silence is a weapon, not a weakness. Then she exhaled, slow and exact, and raised her eyes. Not to Caitlin, but to the cameras. "I've seen that memo," she began, her voice lower than before, but heavier, as if every syllable was bearing the weight of communities whose names never made it into headlines. "And I know what it says. I also know what it doesn't say." She turned back to Caitlin, but her gaze wasn't defensive. It was surgical. "It doesn't mention the 5-year backlog in local infrastructure requests that predates this administration. It doesn't include the state-level reallocations that gutted baseline projections before a single federal dollar was distributed. And it certainly doesn't mention the 19 override requests from Republican-led state boards that stripped implementation authority from Black-led municipalities before the ink on this policy was even dry." Her voice sharpened, not in volume, but in clarity. "Data doesn't lie, Caitlin," she said, "but it can be manipulated, especially when it's pulled from context and weaponized for spectacle." Caitlin opened her mouth, but Jasmine raised a hand, not to silence her, but to hold the space. "I will not," she continued, "stand here and allow my work to be distorted into a soundbite, just so someone can clip 15 seconds for their YouTube Shorts reel." There it was, not rage, not retreat, command. This isn't about exposure. This is about impact. And if we're going to talk about equity, real equity, then we have to stop pretending that temporary funding gaps in legacy broken systems are proof of betrayal. Her tone was cutting now, but still controlled. Because if that's the standard, then we should have interrogated every senator who passed a budget without a single Black health clinic in it for 20 years. The room was dead quiet, not a shuffle, not a whisper. "I came here to discuss solutions," she said, voice now lowering again, returning to that deadly calm. "But if we've reached a point where nuance is no longer allowed, where data without narrative is called a scandal, then we're not doing journalism. We're doing theater." Her final words struck like a gavel. "You asked how I explain it," she said, looking not at Caitlin now, but into the eye of the lens, the nation behind the glass. "I don't, because facts aren't something I explain away. They're something I fix. And I will never apologize for facing the rot of systemic injustice with the imperfection of real action." One of the CSPAN operators muttered something under his breath. A few reporters looked down, as if ashamed to have waited for a stumble. Caitlin said nothing. She didn't need to. The damage had been contained, but not by silence, by truth. Delivered not as a defense, but as a counterstrike. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't just parried. She had reclaimed the moment, with precision, with weight, with fire wrapped in composure. But Caitlin wasn't retreating. She was doubling down. And her next line didn't just challenge Jasmine's authority. It questioned her very legitimacy, not as a policymaker, but as a woman allowed to stand at that podium. "The public has a right to know," Caitlin fired, her voice rising above the hush of the chamber. Not uncontrolled, but amplified with theatrical precision. "Or is it that you only show strength in viral clips, afraid of real data when there's no edit button to protect you?" Her words slammed against the walls like the crack of a gavel in a courtroom that had already judged her. She wasn't asking anymore. She was accusing. The delivery wasn't accidental. It was laced with performance. Time for the moment when the nation would be watching, screens blinking across newsrooms, homes, and cell phones. Her phrasing wasn't about truth. It was about branding Jasmine as a fraud, as a political influencer rather than a legislator, someone addicted to applause but allergic to accountability. The insult wasn't even buried. It was direct, cutting, and personal. And for the first time, it wasn't just the content that carried weight. It was the smirk in Caitlin's tone, the quiet sneer that suggested Jasmine was out of her depth. Somewhere in the third row, A reporter from Reuters shook his head. In the back, a C-SPAN producer muttered, "That was low." But no one spoke up. Not yet. Jasmine didn't respond right away. She didn't shift, didn't speak, didn't even flinch. The stillness wasn't passive, it was pressure building. 2 seconds passed, long enough for the air to turn brittle, long enough for everyone in the room to feel the question had crossed a threshold from confrontational to contemptuous. Her eyes remained locked forward, not on Caitlin, not on the crowd, but on a fixed, invisible point just beyond the line of cameras. Her silence said what words could not. This wasn't journalism anymore. This was an ambush in designer heels and perfect lighting. Then, with an economy of motion that screamed control, Jasmine turned her head, not sharply, but with deliberate restraint. Just enough to meet the gaze of the security officer stationed at the side wall. She didn't raise a hand. She didn't utter a command. All it took was that single glance. It was measured, calm, deadly, but its meaning was unmistakable. The spell had broken. The room, which had teetered between scrutiny and spectacle, had finally collapsed into something Jasmine would no longer tolerate. Caitlin might have come for confrontation, but Jasmine had come for truth. And when truth was drowned beneath insult and showmanship, she knew exactly where the line was. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was judgment. Every person in that room, from the interns with trembling notepads to the veteran anchors adjusting their earpieces, understood what they had just witnessed. The moment a leader decided that enough was enough. And as the unspoken order hung heavy in the air, it was the sound of a single shoe against marble, the slow, deliberate step of security, that ruptured the illusion that this was still just a press conference. The security officer's movement wasn't loud, but it sent a jolt through the room like a tremor before an earthquake. One step forward, measured, precise, and deafening in implication. The effect was immediate. A ripple of awareness swept across the gallery. Reporters who had moments ago been frozen by spectacle now leaned forward, eyes darting between Caitlin and Jasmine, unsure whether they were witnessing enforcement or escalation. Caitlin didn't move. She stayed seated, her posture regal, her expression controlled, but in her eyes a flicker of triumph shimmered. She had anticipated this moment. Maybe she'd even orchestrated it. She slowly turned her gaze to Jasmine, letting a smug smile bleed into the corners of her lips, then delivered the line she knew would detonate far beyond that room. "Oh, so this is it?" she said, voice sharpened into mock disbelief. "You're silencing me now? Just like your administration silences the people it doesn't want to hear?" It wasn't a question. It was bait, carefully laced with self-righteous venom and aimed straight at the camera feed streaming live into millions of homes. The accusation didn't come from curiosity. It came from design. Caitlin's tone wrapped itself in the pretense of principle, but underneath it was a calculated move to recast herself, not as the aggressor who had hijacked the briefing, but as the brave voice being shut down. Her words weren't for the room. They were for the headlines already being drafted. Crockett has reporter removed during tough questioning. Freedom of press under fire? She had taken control of the narrative, or so she thought. Jasmine didn't rush to respond. Her stillness wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. And when she did speak, it was with the kind of cold, unwavering clarity that silences more than a room. It silences spin. "Freedom of speech," Jasmine said, her voice low but laced with steel, "is not the same thing as a license to dominate every second of airtime." She stepped forward, not physically but rhetorically, her presence filling the space in a way no decibel ever could. "This is not a show. This is not an audition for a panel slot, and this certainly isn't your monologue." Her gaze didn't drift. It locked. If you came here to ask questions in good faith, you'd have been heard. But if your intention was to hijack this forum and dress it up as press freedom, then understand this. Freedom comes with limits. And this is where yours end. No shouting, no anger, just a line in the marble floor drawn with quiet precision. It wasn't censorship, it was consequence. And for the first time in the entire exchange, Caitlin didn't respond, not because she couldn't, but because there was nothing left to twist. Jasmine had stripped the moment of its theatrics and exposed the core. Not confrontation, not conflict, but control. And Jasmine Crockett had just taken it back. Jasmine's final declaration had struck with surgical clarity, but in a room built for headlines, clarity wasn't always the final word. Caitlin knew it, and as the silence settled, she prepared her exit, not as retreat, but as the opening act of a new narrative already rehearsed in her mind. Caitlin didn't storm out. That would have been too messy, too reactive. Instead, she rose with a deliberate grace that betrayed preparation. Her movements were smooth, theatrical, like a curtain call. She reached for her leather tote, slung it over her shoulder in one fluid motion, then paused. Every second of it was calculated. The arch of her posture, the defiant lift of her chin, the way her eyes scanned the press gallery, not for support, but for cameras. They were still rolling. Red lights on every rig blinked back at her like a constellation of digital judgment. She knew how this worked. This was no longer about Jasmine. It wasn't about policy. It was about who would leave the room with the last word etched into the American psyche. Caitlin turned to face the press, her voice calm but soaked in venomous implication. "I'll leave it to the public," she said, louder now. Not shouted, but projected like she'd practiced it. "Let them decide who really dodged the hard questions today." The moment cracked like a whip through the room. Her tone wasn't explosive. It was surgical. Her words didn't plead for justice. They asserted it, as if the facts were already on her side. Her exit line wasn't for debate. It was for replay, for clip reels, for Twitter headlines and primetime panels. And she knew it. Caitlin Collins wasn't just walking out of a briefing. She was stepping into the role of protagonist in the story she had already drafted in her head. The lone journalist who dared to speak truth to power and got silenced for it. And the room responded accordingly. Cameras pivoted on their gimbals to follow her path as she stepped out from the front row. Sound engineers leaned in. The director in the back control booth of the live stream marked the time code. Even the rhythm of the room changed, from combustion to capture. Caitlin's shoes clicked softly on the polished floor, and in that stillness, her echo felt louder than any raised voice. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already framed her walkout as a stand. And in today's media warfare, the walkout had become the new statement. But it wasn't just the cameras that followed. Human eyes did too, half calculating, half conflicted. Some saw courage, others saw choreography, but all of them saw the play. From the far right of the press gallery, a Fox News field correspondent leaned sideways in his seat, his voice a whisper, but edged with certainty. "There it is," he muttered almost reverently. "That's the clip. That'll be on every 7 p.m. slot tonight." His producer beside him nodded, already reaching for her phone, likely to alert the digital team. No one laughed. No one corrected him, because he was right. It wasn't the confrontation that would define the day. It was the image of the exit, of Caitlin walking out with her shoulders squared, her face set, and her voice still echoing. Let the public decide. Never mind the hours of policy discussion that came before. Never mind the data, the tension, the control Jasmine had exercised in the face of relentless provocation. What the world would remember was the exit. And in that exit, Caitlin had successfully reframed herself, from instigator to casualty, from media aggressor to silenced truth-teller. And Jasmine? She didn't speak. She didn't interrupt. She watched, not with rage, not with resignation, but with the piercing stillness of someone who understood the deeper injustice playing out in real time. Because this wasn't just about one woman standing up and walking out. It was about what that walkout would be turned into. A headline written before the confrontation even began. A script rehearsed in full before the cameras had powered on. Jasmine wasn't losing control. She was watching it being taken and sold. She had stood her ground, answered the questions, countered the distortions, drawn a line between dialogue and disruption. And yet now, the moment was being hijacked in front of her, with no need for rebuttal, no need for facts. Caitlin was leaving, yes, but she was leaving with the final frame, the moment she had baited, the headline she had built herself to fit. And the country wouldn't see the hours, the complexity, the nuance. They'd see 30 seconds of a journalist walking out and a congresswoman standing still. And that, Jasmine knew, was the deepest injustice of all. Because for all the control she'd maintained, all the discipline and precision she had brought to the confrontation, the world still hungered for the image of collapse, not the integrity of endurance. And that image had just walked out the door, already pixelating into a viral post. But Jasmine did not move. She did not panic. Because if there was one thing she knew, it was this. The truth doesn't always win in the moment, but it survives in the echoes. Before the echo of Caitlyn's final line had even faded from the marble chamber, the outside world had already sunk its teeth into the footage. Raw, looping, mutating. Amplified not by what was said, but by how it looked on screen. By the time Caitlin Collins reached the Capitol steps, her exit had already metastasized across the internet like wildfire beneath dry brush. In under 8 minutes, the clip, her standing, turning, delivering that perfectly staged line about the public deciding, was spliced into TikToks with swelling piano music, edited into Twitter reels with hashtags like Free Press Under Fire, and overlaid on YouTube commentary segments with titles screaming, "Journalist walks out on Jasmine Crockett. Watch her shutdown." No context, no nuance. Just a loop of departure, dramatized silence, and the illusion of moral high ground. The internet wasn't interested in the truth of the exchange. It was drunk on the visual of a woman walking out as if from a courtroom. Head high, bags slung over her shoulder, branded instantly as the lone soldier of press freedom. It was performance, and the world applauded the act without ever reading the script. News outlets scrambled to stake their narrative claims. CNN's homepage bore a cropped still of Jasmine mid-sentence, hand raised in restraint, mouth half open. The headline read, "Crockett dodges question on racial equity data, reporter escorted out." Beneath it, a subline leaned further into implication. Democrat lawmaker refuses to directly address funding discrepancies flagged in leaked memo. No mention of the sustained hour of answers. No acknowledgement of provocation. No footage of Caitlin's repeated interruptions, her premeditated ambush. The nuance had been surgically removed, stripped down until only a frame remained. Jasmine as the aggressor, and Caitlin as the victim of uncomfortable truth. Within minutes, the clip climbed CNN's trending sidebar, sandwiched between an election poll update and a celebrity divorce. But not every outlet told the same story. Across the digital aisle, the Daily Wire countered with the fury of a fist slamming down on a chessboard. Their headline read, "Jasmine Crockett holds the line, exposes CNN's Caitlin Collins in manufactured showdown." The accompanying article was pure blitz, paragraphs praising Jasmine's composure, her refusal to bow to what they labeled ambush journalism. Screenshots from the full CSPAN broadcast were posted side by side with the viral TikTok edit to highlight the difference. Where one showed Caitlin leaving in heroic silence, the other captured her mid-interruption, her voice slicing across Jasmine's answer like a scalpel without anesthesia. "This wasn't journalism," the article snarled. "This was theater," and Jasmine Crockett refused to be cast in someone else's script. Meanwhile, Twitter descended into chaos. The platform exploded with threads, counter-threads, dueling video edits, and real-time polls asking users to weigh in on who was in the right. The hashtags multiplied. Crockett and Collins, freedom or framing, journalism or jousting. On one side, progressive activists called Jasmine a coward in pearls, accusing her of censoring questions inconvenient to her narrative. On the other, grassroots organizers flooded timelines with data graphs, time-stamped quotes, and the full uncut live stream, demanding, "Watch the whole video before you judge her." But most people didn't. They didn't want 42 minutes of policy. They wanted 15 seconds of combat. Even late-night talk shows joined the frenzy. On The Daily Show, a guest host played the viral clip twice, then quipped, "When did press briefings become UFC weigh-ins?" Laughter roared, but not everyone was laughing. Inside Jasmine's digital war room, her staffers monitored the unfolding storm across 6 screens. Twitter's trending feed, YouTube's recommended now, Reddit's front page. One aide scrolled through a stream of insults so vile they had to mute the browser audio. Another checked an internal report. Engagement on her press clip had tripled, but over 70% of the reposts were out-of-context slices. Jasmine stood behind them in silence, arms folded, watching herself replayed as both villain and hero on two different networks. Her jaw was set. She wasn't angry. She was infinitely tired of a system where control wasn't won by clarity, but by cutting. She took a step closer to the largest monitor, the one split between live news feeds, and paused on MSNBC's coverage. Their segment was running a panel titled, "When Elected Officials Shut Down Tough Questions." A legal analyst was already halfway through condemning her actions. Even if the reporter was aggressive, Crockett's decision to involve security sends a chilling signal to journalists everywhere. It suggests boundaries where there should be accountability. Another panelist interjected, "But we can't ignore that the reporter was disrupting the flow." "Disruption is part of the job," the host snapped. "If politicians can't handle pressure, they shouldn't be at the podium." Jasmine turned away. The room stayed silent, save for the muted flicker of talking heads and the blinking of a dozen notification alerts piling up on the campaign phone. A junior staffer cleared his throat and said quietly, "Ma'am, should we put out a statement?" Jasmine didn't answer at first. Her eyes were fixed on the C-SPAN raw feed playing in the corner, a quiet, uncut version of the event, where her answers remained intact, and the sequence of events was unedited, uninterrupted, untouched by spin. "That statement's already out," she finally said, voice low, measured. "It's in the footage no one's watching." Another aide suggested drafting a direct response to the CNN headline, maybe pairing it with a visual thread breaking down the funding report Caitlin had cited. Jasmine nodded once, but said nothing. She wasn't afraid of the facts. She was afraid of the framing. Because in this era, the truth didn't spread unless it was scandalous. And standing your ground wasn't news, unless someone called it suppression. She took a deep breath and walked toward the conference table, placing both palms flat against the wood. "We won't chase the narrative," she said firmly. "We'll correct the record, slowly, patiently, but on our terms, not theirs." The room didn't cheer. They nodded. It wasn't victory, but it was resolve. A quiet one. The kind that outlasts trends. Back online, the battlefield raged on. One TikTok clip showed Caitlin's exit overlaid with dramatic violins. Another spliced Jasmine's stare at the camera into a meme labeled, "When you realize freedom of speech has a mute button." The storm wasn't dying, it was evolving. But in the center of it, the truth sat unbothered, unshared, uncelebrated. Because while lies outran the facts, Jasmine Crockett refused to run with them. She stood still. And sometimes stillness is the loudest sound in the room. As the digital storm raged outside her office, churning truth into fodder and nuance into noise, Jasmine Crockett stood in the eye of it, surrounded by screens, advisors, and a war of words she had no intention of fighting on someone else's terms. The room was a hive of urgency. Advisors circled her like satellites, arms full of draft statements, media rebuttals, and rapid response talking points freshly minted from comms templates used 100 times before. One aide suggested leading with civility. Another pushed a counterattack, a direct quote from Caitlin's interruptions, paired with timestamps. A third read aloud a bullet-pointed memo titled, "Correcting the Narrative." Jasmine didn't move. She sat at the edge of the conference table, back straight, elbows on her knees, watching the chaos unfold with the stillness of someone who had already made up her mind. The voices clashed. Speed versus silence, offense versus restraint. They wanted strategy. She wanted clarity. They wanted to manage optics. She wanted to reveal the truth. Her eyes drifted to the screen showing the raw CSPAN feed. Uncut, uninterrupted, honest. And then she spoke. "No statements," she said, slicing through the noise like a clean blade. Heads turned. One aide froze mid-sentence. Jasmine stood, walked to the main monitor, and pointed to the unedited stream playing in the corner. "That," she said, "is our response." The room paused, confused. She turned. "No threads, no apologies, no sound bites. Just post the full footage, start to finish, and put one line above it. Watch it all. No edits. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried the weight of finality. She wasn't asking. She was declaring. Not to spin the story, to end it. The team exchanged glances. Some were hesitant, others relieved. One tech-savvy intern nodded and darted to their laptop, uploading the full, unbroken 47-minute feed with a stark, single-line caption. No emojis, no branding, no filters. Just the raw cut in a dare to anyone watching. See what really happened. And then, silence. For the first 10 minutes, engagement trickled in. A few retweets, a couple of likes. A single journalist commented, full context about time. But then something changed. An education reporter with a large following reposted the video writing, "You won't see this part on the 9 o'clock news." Then a media watchdog account pushed it out, comparing timestamps from the viral edit to the real exchange. Then came the flood. In under an hour, the raw clip crossed 8 million views. The number didn't climb. It detonated. TikTokers began stitching themselves, reacting to the entire exchange. Political podcasters dropped their scheduled segments to do breakdowns. Journalists, actual journalists, who had stayed silent during the frenzy, now cautiously tweeted, "In fairness, watch the full interaction before forming conclusions." It wasn't a tidal wave of support. It wasn't redemption. It was something rarer. Correction. And for Jasmine, it wasn't vindication. It was validation. Not of herself, but of her refusal to play the game. She had watched dozens of public figures fall trying to fight spin with more spin, distortion with rage, panic with posts. And she had said no. She had chosen transparency. No edits, no flash. Just the hard, uncomfortable, full truth. Back in the room, the team was speechless. Phones buzzed with alerts. News anchors now quoted her line, not Caitlyn's. "Watch it all. No edits." It was turning into a phrase, a standard, a quiet war cry for those tired of truth being chopped into rating segments. And Jasmine? She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just leaned forward and whispered what none of them had yet dared to believe. They expected me to react, but I just revealed. And in a world built on cuts, filters, and spin, she had weaponized the one thing no one could manipulate: the uncut, unvarnished, undeniable truth. As the digital echo of Caitlyn Collins' dramatic exit surged through social media feeds, a different kind of clarity was forming. Not from influencers or commentators, but from a voice that had outlasted decades of media spin, a veteran journalist on a national broadcast whose restraint would cut deeper than any viral clip. On a quiet Sunday evening, just past 7 p.m. Eastern, millions of Americans tuned into 60 Minutes, not expecting fireworks, but perhaps answers. What they got was something rarer, a scalpel. The studio was subdued, lit in a soft gray-blue wash that gave everything a sense of solemnity, even gravity. There were no ticker tapes flashing across the screen, no graphics exploding into view. Just a single camera, and at its center, Thomas Whitaker. Whitaker wasn't new to controversy. Over 4 decades, his voice had narrated civil wars in foreign lands, unspooled Watergate timelines in calm monotone, and held presidents accountable without ever once raising his own voice. But tonight, he leaned into the lens with a quiet intensity that hinted this would not be just another segment. He adjusted his glasses, lifted a sheet of paper, the transcript of the now viral press conference, and began. "Let's be very clear," he said, each word delivered with surgical weight. "No one silenced Caitlyn Collins. She asked her questions. She pushed boundaries. She received a response. What she didn't get was control of the room, because today, she simply wasn't the main character." The air seemed to freeze. No music played. The camera didn't cut away. It lingered on Whitaker, allowing his words to settle like dust in a battlefield that had just gone silent. Across the country, heads turned. In newsrooms, earbuds were pushed in tighter. In political war rooms, interns stopped typing. And in the offices of Jasmine Crockett's staff, a stunned kind of stillness took over. Because in less than 10 seconds, Thomas Whitaker had done what hours of punditry, thousands of tweets, and entire reels of media spin had failed to do. He told the truth without bias, without venom, without spectacle. The panel seated beside him, three former White House correspondents and a constitutional law expert, said nothing for a full 5 seconds. And in broadcast time, that's an eternity. When they finally did respond, it was with measured breath. Whitaker continued, "We are so conditioned to confuse confrontation with courage. But courage today came in the form of something far less cinematic. A refusal to turn a press briefing into performance art. A refusal to take the bait." Those words, "take the bait," would end up headlining dozens of think pieces within hours. Twitter's algorithm lit up. Hashtags like #main character syndrome and #not silenced shot to the top. But it was one phrase in particular. She simply wasn't the main character, that detonated across every digital platform. People weren't arguing. They were nodding. Inside the CNN newsroom, the moment wasn't ignored. It was dissected. In private Slack channels, producers exchanged frantic messages. Did we lose the thread on this? Should we reframe Caitlyn's coverage? Thomas Whitaker just ended this narrative in 15 seconds flat. On the other side of the aisle at Fox News, the tone also shifted. Previously leaning into the story as one of Jasmine dodging tough questions, their editorial team now faced an awkward recalibration. A midday host noted on air, "Whether you agree with Representative Crockett or not, you can't deny she owned the room by not feeding into the drama." In the Crockett war room, Jasmine didn't speak. Her staff watched Whitaker's clip on repeat. One aide whispered, "He did more for us in 1 minute than any press release we could have written." But Jasmine merely leaned back in her chair, eyes locked on the screen, stone still. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She was absorbing. Because in her silence, something louder had happened. Elsewhere, students in journalism schools rewound the clip and transcribed Whitaker's phrasing as an example of editorial integrity. Political science professors used the moment in real-time lectures about media framing and manufactured outrage. Even cable producers across networks quietly began discussing how they'd allowed confrontation to replace curiosity, how personality had overtaken policy. The next morning, the ripple became a wave. The New York Times ran a headline, "When Silence Wins the Press Room and the Power of Restraint." The Wall Street Journal wrote, "The story that refused to be hijacked." The Atlantic published an essay titled simply, "Not the Main Character." Meanwhile, digital engagement soared. On YouTube, Jasmine Crockett's unedited press conference, titled exactly as she had ordered, "Watch it all, no edits," crossed 11 million views by noon. The top comment read, "This woman kept her composure while the room tried to write her downfall. That's leadership." Another read, "No viral spin, no soundbite manipulation, just calm, collected, brutal facts." She didn't silence anyone. She simply refused to surrender the floor. But perhaps the most viral comment was the shortest. She didn't shout. She outlasted. And that phrase, "she outlasted," became its own anthem. Back at CNN, Caitlin Collins remained silent. No tweets, no interviews. Even her usual allies in the press began to retreat from earlier defenses. A quietly retracted op-ed that once accused Jasmine of hostile evasion was replaced with a more neutral headline. Did the press go too far? By midweek, polling data revealed a shift. While approval ratings are rarely moved by a single press event, Jasmine's numbers among independent voters had climbed 4 points. Among younger voters, her net favorability had jumped even higher. But more tellingly, across demographic lines, when asked, "Who do you think demonstrated greater leadership in the press exchange?" 64% chose Jasmine Crockett. Only 18% chose Caitlin. The rest were undecided. What Jasmine had done, or more precisely, what she had not done, was force the country to reevaluate how it defines strength. She hadn't lashed out. She hadn't stormed off. She hadn't even spiked the ball in victory. She had remained. She stood in the storm and let it pass. Not because she couldn't fight, but because she knew when not to. And that judgment, that discipline, that sense of timing was what elevated her from a politician to a public force. Thomas Whitaker, for his part, gave no follow-up comment. He didn't tweet. He didn't write an op-ed. He returned to his regular programming the following week as if nothing had happened, but he had dropped a truth bomb so elegant and surgical that even his competitors struggled to dismiss it. And Jasmine, she went back to work. No victory lap, no press junket, no morning show glow-up. Because she understood something the media was just beginning to remember. The goal of public service isn't to win moments, it's to win trust. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a leader can do is refuse to let the moment become about them. The press cycle moved on, as it always does. But what lingered wasn't Caitlyn's voice, or even Whitaker's measured verdict. It was a silence, deliberate, strategic, almost haunting, from the one person everyone still wanted to hear. Jasmine Crockett. Despite mounting pressure from media networks scrambling for an exclusive, Jasmine Crockett turned each offer away. NBC sent a formal request the morning after the viral clip. CNN followed 3 hours later, this time with a personal message from their primetime anchor. By day's end, ABC, MSNBC, and even FOX-NEWS extended interview invitations, framing their outreach in polite urgency. "Clarify your position," they pleaded. "Set the record straight." One producer even promised a full hour of unedited airtime, citing public interest. Jasmine declined them all. There was no press junket, no victory tour, no follow-up panel discussion with sycophantic hosts lining up to praise her. Instead, behind the security-tightened walls of her DC office, she gathered only her senior staff, locked the door, and opened a blank email window. What she typed was not a strategy memo or a talking point outline. It was a warning, a philosophy, and a boundary all in one. Sometimes you don't need to argue. You just let them expose themselves. She sent it without a subject line. The message hit inboxes like a gavel. Firm, final, and unmistakably her. Her media advisor stared at the screen in disbelief. "That's it?" he asked aloud. Jasmine didn't reply. She stood at the window, watching the Potomac glint in the afternoon light like a long, coiled wire. In a world built on constant reaction, her silence was thunderous. It wasn't avoidance. It was calculation. And it rattled the entire ecosystem. Back at CNN, executive producers were baffled. "Why isn't she defending herself?" one asked. "Why won't she counter the spin?" another demanded. The control room stared at a wall of empty graphics. Lower thirds they had designed in advance. Crockett responds to silencing claim. Inside the press room chaos. Is she a hero or a dodger? None of it would air. Jasmine Crockett wasn't giving them anything. Not even a soundbite. Meanwhile, in her campaign headquarters, aides debated whether her silence would be mistaken for guilt. One urged her to release a clarifying statement, a neutral tone, no names, just principles. But Jasmine shook her head and said only, "When the room is still echoing, don't shout into it. Let them hear what they said." Her team didn't argue again. Hours later, a cryptic post appeared on her official X account. Not a statement, not a press release. Just a black background, white font, and a single sentence, centered like a neon blade. "Do you believe in truth or in whoever yells the loudest?" No caption, no hashtags, no call to action. The image alone detonated across platforms. It was retweeted over 200,000 times in 6 hours. On Instagram, influencers across the political spectrum, left, right, independent, reposted it without commentary, as if they all instinctively understood the weight it carried. Political operatives on Capitol Hill scrambled. Staffers from both parties whispered about it in the halls. "Did you see her post? Is she aiming at Caitlyn? Or is this bigger than that?" Cable news hosts fumbled to fill airtime without her. The narrative they'd prepared, of Crockett being evasive, combative, or performative, collapsed under the precision of her restraint. She wasn't dodging, she was framing. She wasn't hiding, she was highlighting. Late that night, an anonymous editor at the Washington Post leaked a draft headline that had been pulled hours before publication. "Crockett refuses to answer tough questions." It had been scrapped after the editorial board watched the full, unedited footage again. This time without commentary, just raw interaction. And what they saw wasn't evasion. It was escalation. Not by Crockett, but by Caitlin. The leak stirred even more attention. The narrative wasn't just slipping, it was turning. By morning, late-night hosts pivoted. What had once been fodder for satire turned into a quiet reflection. Stephen Colbert, normally fast with a punchline, opened his monologue differently. He looked straight into the camera and said, "Maybe we need to ask why the calmest person in the room was the one under attack." Cheers erupted from his live audience, but they were different this time. Not laughs, not applause lines. Something closer to agreement, maybe even awakening. On Reddit, a thread titled, "The Art of Saying Nothing," and "Winning" topped the front page. One comment read, "Jasmine Crockett just taught a masterclass in restraint." Everyone else was acting for the cameras. She was speaking to the people. And she was. But not through interviews. Not through cable segments. Through absence. The kind that makes you look harder at what's already there. Back in her office, Jasmine flipped open her laptop and scanned dozens of clips being sent to her. Edits from young content creators, reaction videos, podcasts dissecting her tone, her posture, even the slight tilt of her chin when she refused to engage Caitlin's final provocation. One clip froze the frame where she looked directly at the camera, unblinking, spine straight, and dubbed it, "The moment the room became hers." She closed the laptop. She didn't need to watch it again. She had lived it, breath by breath. Outside her building, reporters still camped out, hoping for a brief statement, a walk and talk, a quote they could use to resurrect the cycle. But Jasmine walked past them each day like fog, untouchable, unmoved. She had already said everything she needed to. And that final sentence, that question posted like a quiet grenade on her socials, kept haunting people. Do you believe in truth or in whoever yells the loudest? It was no longer just about her. It was about every headline they'd ever read. Every moment they'd seen a woman of color interrupted, talked over, misquoted. Every time outrage had been mistaken for urgency. Every moment a policy conversation had been hijacked by ego. She had let the country feel the imbalance, not by talking about it, but by letting it play out, uncut. She made America watch itself in the mirror and ask what it valued more, information or volume. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett proved something that could never be measured in polling data or broadcast share. She proved that silence, when earned, when wielded, when sharpened, isn't weakness, it's power, refined, undeniable, unshakable. And as the dust settled, even her critics had to admit, she never raised her voice, but she raised the bar. And while the cameras finally dimmed and the headlines shifted to the next outrage, something deeper lingered, not in the news cycle, but in the hearts of those who watched it all unfold. Sometimes the real battle isn't fought on stage, in front of microphones or beneath the floodlights of a press room. It's fought in the quiet spaces afterward, when the world rewinds the footage in their minds and starts asking themselves the hard questions. Jasmine Crockett didn't just endure a media ambush, she flipped it into a national reflection, because beneath the sharp lines and viral exchanges was a deeper wound she had forced everyone to confront. That truth too often is buried under performance, that justice too often must ask permission before it speaks. The human cost of that imbalance, the exhaustion, the isolation, the relentless distortion, doesn't trend on Twitter, but it lives in every woman who's been talked over, every person of color who's been reduced to a soundbite, every public servant who's had to choose between dignity and defense. Jasmine chose neither. She chose defiance through calm, and that became her resistance. She didn't humiliate her attacker. She didn't weaponize her pain. She let the moment reveal itself for what it was, a trial not of facts, but of fairness. And the jury was every American watching. What she proved, without shouting, without pleading, was this: silence is not surrender, it is strategy. Restraint is not weakness, it is wisdom. And letting someone show you who they are, before telling them who you are, is sometimes the only way to shift the ground beneath a conversation poisoned by spectacle. But perhaps the most profound lesson Jasmine left behind wasn't about politics or media spin. It was about trust. She trusted the public to think, to pause, to replay, to understand that leadership doesn't always look like a counterpunch. Sometimes it looks like a mirror. And in a culture starving for clarity, for integrity, for truth spoken without theatrics, that trust became revolutionary. In the end, it wasn't Jasmine's words that shook the press corps. It was her restraint. It wasn't her comeback that went viral. It was her composure. And it wasn't Caitlin's accusation that people remembered. It was the way Jasmine never stooped to answer it on her terms. She changed the terms. And that in itself is a lesson, not just for reporters, not just for politicians, but for everyone who's ever been forced to explain their own worth, when the silence in the room said more than words ever could. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a packed congressional hearing streamed across 7 platforms to over 17 million viewers, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronts MSNBC host Nicole Wallace over a chilling accusation, using a traumatized 12-year-old survivor, DJ Daniel, as political bait. Wallace defends herself under the bright Capitol lights, preaching journalistic integrity, until Jasmine plays a 2-minute unreleased clip that stops the room cold. A voice laughs off the boy's pain, a whisper becomes a weapon, and the balance of power flips. With reputations crumbling and a nation watching, one question explodes across every screen. What happens when the voice trusted to tell the truth is the one that buried it? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. 10 a.m. Capitol Hill was under siege. Not by protesters, not by legislation, but by truth sharpening its blade. Inside room 416 of the Rayburn House office building, the air buzzed with a voltage that only comes when millions are watching. Live. Seated beneath the white-hot spotlight was Nicole Wallace, dressed in a steel gray blazer, hair perfectly waved, face powdered into perfection. But no layer of foundation could mask the tremor in her left hand. She gripped the table edge, not in poise, but survival. Behind the gloss of a seasoned media icon was a woman surrounded by doubt and accusation, seconds from becoming the story instead of shaping it. Suddenly, the chamber doors creaked open, not dramatically, but decisively. Jasmine Crockett entered like a judgment made flesh, her heels silent, her presence deafening. She wore midnight black with a crimson pin, subtle but surgical. Her eyes never once turned toward Wallace. She did not nod. She did not pause. She crossed the marble floor with the precision of a closing verdict and placed a single object before her on the polished wood, a 5-centimeter thick black dossier, tabbed in matte red with a single word burned into its cover. Exposé, not a file, a fuse. Members of the committee leaned in, cameras refocused. Wallace's fingers twitched near her water glass, but she didn't drink. She couldn't. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The folder alone had already changed the temperature of the room, and outside, across America, 17 million viewers sat forward in their chairs, hearts racing, waiting for the first incision. And just as the silence from the exposé folder began suffocating the air, Nicole Wallace drew in a shallow breath, adjusted her mic with a calculated grace, and leaned forward. The room, though still, felt like it was bracing for impact. Cameras panned closer. The viewers, now over 18 million, watched, not blinking. She began speaking with the smooth cadence of a media veteran, her voice steady, polished, and dressed in righteous conviction. In the face of rising authoritarianism, she declared, her gaze sweeping across the committee, a free press is not a luxury. It is the final line of defense. Her words struck the microphones with a tone that demanded reverence, as though they were etched into marble the moment they left her lips. She held each sentence with deliberate pause, letting them hang in the air like banners of self-sacrifice. I have dedicated my career to truth, she continued. eyes softening just enough to feign vulnerability. Even when it was unpopular, even when it was uncomfortable. The room didn't move. She nodded once, slow and solemn. We do not need protection from hard truths. We need the courage to face them. A few murmurs of agreement whispered through the gallery. Somewhere in the back, a producer scribbled notes, perhaps thinking this could be salvage. But Jasmine Crockett remained stone still, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't interrupt. She didn't interject. She simply waited until the final syllable of Wallace's speech was drowned by its own echo. Then, without looking up, Jasmine tapped the screen before her with a single finger. One soundless motion. The LED screen behind the witness table flickered, then burst to life. It wasn't dramatized. It wasn't cut with soundtracks or graphics. What played was raw footage, time-stamped, direct from the MSNBC vault. Nicole Wallace's voice emerged again, but stripped of performance, stripped of intent. It wasn't the polished op-ed style she had just delivered. It was colder, cleaner, more lethal. If this boy, DJ Daniel, ends up like so many officers who took their lives after January 6th, who's going to tell that story? The words landed like a punch through glass. Audible gasps rippled across the chamber. One of the stenographers dropped her pen. A senior Republican leaned forward, lips parting in disbelief. The room was not just stunned, it was wounded. In 30 seconds, the entire illusion of principled journalism, of noble intent, began to unravel like thread from the hem of a decaying flag. And still Jasmine said nothing. She waited until the clip ended. No transitions, no fade to black. Just the blunt termination of a voice that had, for years, framed national conversations. Then Jasmine leaned in, voice sharp and calm, slicing through the silence like a scalpel to infected skin. They call that commentary. They called it insight. I call it what it is, an assassination of a child's dignity. No dramatics, no raised tone, just surgical precision. You took a boy fighting cancer and used him as a cautionary tale for chaos he never caused. Wallace didn't speak. Her eyes flickered, but not with denial, with the weight of something darker, realization. This wasn't journalism, it was projection with a body count. No one moved, not the staffers, not the press. The cameras kept rolling, capturing not just a moment, but an unraveling. And as Jasmine leaned back into her chair, folder unopened, Wallace's opening speech already belonged to another timeline, a version of history that no longer held power in this room. And just when the tension in the room felt like it had reached its peak, when the air itself seemed to cling to Jasmine Crockett's final devastating words about dignity and distortion, something shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, terrifyingly quiet. Jasmine turned, just slightly, toward the court technician seated at the console, and with a voice that felt colder than the marble beneath their feet, said, "Play Exhibit 12. The lights didn't dim this time. They didn't need to. What followed wasn't visual. It was a sound, a voice, a truth stripped bare of any script, lighting, or spin. A low static crackled through the overhead speakers for half a second. Then came the audio, clean, recorded in a production meeting, time-stamped and verified. "Put his name in the segment?" Nicole Wallace's voice said, relaxed, amused. Then she laughed. Software controlled, but unmistakable. The laugh of someone who didn't think anyone else would ever hear it. And then the second sentence fell, like a brick through glass. "Not because he's special, but because the reaction will be." The moment the sentence ended, a jarring beep sounded across the speakers, an FCC standard censor tone. But it was too late. Whatever that final word was, whatever context the editors tried to conceal, its absence only sharpened the cruelty of what remained. The reaction wasn't immediate. It was delayed, like shock before the pain. No one screamed, no one stood, but faces changed. Postures stiffened. Aides stopped typing. Reporters stopped scribbling. Every camera operator instinctively zoomed closer to Wallace's face, hoping for even the smallest crack in the mask. She sat frozen, eyes locked forward, lips pressed in a tight, bloodless line. Her shoulders rose and fell in short, shallow bursts. The flush of embarrassment had long passed. What remained was the pallor of exposure, and not the kind she was used to behind anchor desks and strategic narratives. This was the exposure of motive, of calculation laid bare, the kind no retraction could retract. In that moment, Nicole Wallace wasn't a respected journalist. She wasn't a political analyst. She wasn't even a defendant. She was something far more dangerous, a figure who had used her platform not for illumination, but for manipulation. Jasmine didn't look at her. She didn't gloat. That would have cheapened the moment. Instead, she remained perfectly still, allowing the silence to do what words could never accomplish, letting it breathe, letting it linger, letting every soul in that chamber sit with the realization that what had once been dismissed as just media had in fact been methodically engineered impact. And that impact had a name: DJ Daniel, a child, a cancer survivor, a symbol turned into a soundbite, a boy whose suffering was calculated as effective content. The room sat with that knowledge, swallowed it, choked on it, and just when it seemed like the silence might finally break into outrage or defense, a voice, barely audible but sharp as broken glass, sliced through the quiet. She just buried her own career. The words came from the third row. Representative Linda McGraw, Republican of Tennessee. She wasn't speaking to the floor. She wasn't grandstanding. She thought she was whispering. But the microphone at her desk, sensitive and live, picked it up just enough to be caught by the chamber's closed caption stream and splashed across the bottom of every broadcast in real time. And handed Crockett the shovel. Gasps followed, not from the audacity of the comment, but from its brutal accuracy. And as the last echoes of Wallace's recorded voice faded, leaving behind the scorched wreckage of her intent laid bare, Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't turn toward the cameras, nor did she bask in the tidal shift of momentum crashing silently in her favor. Instead, she leaned forward with the patience of someone holding one final match over a house soaked in gasoline. She pressed a small, discreet remote next to her files, and the LED screen behind her changed once more. No flare, no warning, just a hard cut to a grainy, shadowed figure seated in a sterile room. Their face was obscured with deep pixelation, their voice distorted into a metallic monotone. But the truth that followed couldn't be softened, not by filters, not by darkness. "My name and location have been redacted for safety," the voice began, each word steady but heavy. "I served as an audio engineer on Deadline with Nicole Wallace for 3.5 years. A few heads in the gallery turned sharply, others leaned in. The masked figure continued without pause. "My job was to manage live feeds, segment transitions, and audio cues. But somewhere along the way, that job changed. It stopped being about clarity and started being about strategy." There was a pause, no edits, no cuts, just silence, real and rotting. "Wallace and her producers developed what they called the destruction list," the voice said flatly. "It was a database of keywords, phrases, and tonal indicators, flagged to be layered beneath certain subjects or guests, not for accuracy, but for effect. You could feel the blood leave the room. Some leaned back, others leaned forward, but no one stayed neutral. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. She didn't need to press the moment. The witness was doing that for her. Words like volatile, unhinged, or dangerously naive were repeatedly attached to conservative guests. We were instructed to turn down their mics by 6%, just enough to affect presence, but not enough to trigger complaints. A Democratic aide covered their mouth. Another began typing frantically on their tablet. Black officials and speakers were often framed with phrases like overly emotional or outlier representation, veterans critical of policy, fractured or politically confused, and children, particularly those seen as symbols against progressive narratives, tokenized, or worse, statistical anomalies. That's what we called DJ Daniel behind the scenes. A loud murmur swept through the committee floor. Wallace remained motionless, but her eyes dropped, not to her notes, not to her counsel, but to the space between her hands, which now gripped each other as if trying to hold back the weight of collapse. "These weren't accidents," the voice pressed on. "They were approved scripts, embedded signals, designed to guide viewers' emotions without their conscious awareness. The feed ended abruptly. No thank you, no fade out. Just black, stark, final. And into that brutal vacuum, a voice broke. This one unfiltered, unprepared. It came from the riser near the north wall, where press outlets had been packed elbow to elbow since dawn. A CNN correspondent, still wearing her press badge and earpiece, forgot, just for a moment, that her mic was live. "This isn't an inquiry anymore," she whispered, almost breathless. "This is a dissection of media ethics." The room didn't applaud. It didn't gasp. It froze, because nothing else needed to be said. That sentence hung in the air like a guillotine cable, half cut, half weighted, waiting for gravity. And at the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett, unblinking. And across from her sat Nicole Wallace, no longer a media figure, just a silhouette beneath the surgical light. And just as the last words from the whistleblower faded into an unforgiving silence, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her mic. Not out of habit, but like someone preparing to light the final fuse. Her eyes remained locked on the screen as she spoke, low and unwavering. Exhibit 14, Psychological Autopsy, Officer Marcus L. Halden. The words fell heavy, sterile, and precise. The screen came alive, not with footage this time, but with a document. Stark white, black text, federal letterhead. At the top, bolded, Forensic Psychological Evaluation. Case closed. Suicide by carbon monoxide. April 14th, 2022. The document scrolled slowly, no music, no voiceover, just the brutal cadence of truth laid out line by line. Then the screen froze on a single line, highlighted in glaring yellow. Subject referenced MSNBC segment aired same day. Program, deadline with Nicole Wallace as triggering content. Jasmine paused, then tapped the screen again. This time, a clip began to play. Archived, unedited, from the deadline broadcast dated April 14, 2022. Nicole Wallace was mid-panel, surrounded by analysts, each nodding in sync. The topic, police response during a neighborhood mental health call in Denver. Officer Marcus Halden's body cam footage had surfaced earlier that week, not for misconduct, but simply for review. In the footage, he remained calm, gave repeated verbal de-escalation warnings, and ultimately made no arrest. Yet on air, Wallace offered no such context. "Here's what I see," Wallace said, eyes locked on the screen, voice dripping with clinical disdain. "A man too quick to reach for control and too slow to recognize humanity. It's a textbook case of systemic fear masquerading as authority." The other panelists murmured in agreement. "How many more of these heroes are we going to let define what protection means?" She continued. "It's trauma dressed in a badge." The words weren't shouted. They were delivered calmly, surgically. There was no evidence of misconduct, no formal complaint against Halden, no violent action taken during the encounter. Yet Deadline framed him as a poster child for embedded police dysfunction, using terms like emotionally rigid, hypervigilant, and morally desensitized. His image had been replayed on a loop over moody filters, while Wallace's voiceover casts a psychological verdict. "We need to talk about the officers who pass all the tests, because the rot doesn't always look angry. Sometimes it looks calm." The video stopped. Static silence followed. Jasmine spoke again, voice low and stripped of all courtroom theater. "He served 19 years, 3 precincts, no complaints, 83 de-escalated incidents, 4 commendations, but he was reduced in 7.5 minutes to a cautionary tale." She turned a page in her binder as if slicing through the air. 3 hours after this segment aired, Officer Marcus Halden pulled into his garage, turned on his car, and never left it again. A choked breath escaped somewhere in the gallery. A staffer dropped their pen. The sentence had detonated quietly, but the damage rippled like shock waves beneath the skin. Wallace didn't move. Her posture held, but it was brittle now, as though the slightest noise might fracture it completely. Then the screen shifted again. Jasmine raised a single sheet of paper, aged, slightly creased, a thumb smudge near the bottom edge. She held it with both hands. "This arrived in my office 2 months later," she said. It wasn't written by a lawyer. It wasn't filed with any agenda. It was grief, folded into an envelope and sent by a woman who had just lost everything. Jasmine didn't look at Wallace when she read it. She looked straight ahead. When Mrs. Wallace speaks, millions believe her, and that belief killed my husband. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unbearable. It pressed down on every chest in the room like judgment made manifest, a weight that couldn't be shifted or shared. Jasmine let the letter drop slowly to the table, still open. She didn't say another word. Wallace's eyes dropped, not in surrender but in something darker. Her hand reached out instinctively for the water bottle on the table. Her fingers grasped the cap, but the tension in her wrist betrayed her. The cap slipped. The bottle shifted. She caught it with her other hand, just in time to stop it from falling, but not in time to stop the shaking. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The woman who once commanded primetime narrative now sat visibly unraveling, silenced by the very gravity she had once wielded without restraint. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The evidence was still glowing on the screen. The letter still trembled on the desk. And Officer Marcus Halden's voice, though never heard, had finally spoken. And just as the weight of Officer Halden's story settled into the marrow of every person in the room, his letter still splayed open like an open wound. Jasmine Crockett didn't pause to let the audience recover. She knew recovery wasn't the point. Truth didn't wait. Justice didn't soften. It moved forward like a scalpel, one incision at a time. She turned a page in her binder, slow, deliberate, then looked back up. Her voice when it came was colder now, almost forensic. "We've heard how words can kill," she said. "Now let's examine what bought those words." A ripple passed through the gallery. Jasmine pressed a button on her tablet, and the screen behind her flickered to life once more. This time it wasn't a clip, nor a photo, nor a letter. It was a wire transfer confirmation, stark, digital, real. The words at the top of the document read, "Transfer receipt, Civic Source Initiative LLC to Waverly Gate Media Holdings, April 17th, 2022. Below that, amount $600,000, 00 USD memo line. Content expansion, pre-launch, TBP. The initials were unmistakable. TBP, The Best People, Nicole Wallace's flagship podcast project, announced only days after the DJ Daniel broadcast had gone viral. Jasmine let the numbers sit there, glowing under the soft lights like blood under an ultraviolet scan. "This," she said slowly, "was deposited 3 days after Wallace's nationally televised segment about DJ Daniel, a child fighting brain cancer who by then had become a political lightning rod. Not because he wanted to, but because someone saw value in making him one." She tapped her screen again. The wire receipt was replaced by an email. The header read, "Subject, Narrative Leverage, Reaction Metrics. Post 5, 1-4 segment." The date matched the wire. The sender, a strategic advisor from the Civic Source Initiative. The recipient, an executive from Wallace's media production partner. No names had been redacted. Jasmine had made sure of that. And then, in the body of the email, highlighted in yellow, just one sentence. A sentence that no spin, no press team, no pre-written apology could explain away. "If Wallace still has shock power, tell her to target something sacred to the other side." A symbol. That boy is perfect. The oxygen in the room disappeared. There were no gasps this time, no outbursts, just stillness, pure graveyard stillness. It wasn't just the content of the sentence. It was its precision, the chilling awareness. The coldness of that boy is perfect. As if DJ Daniel were a thumbnail, a data point, a PR move instead of a living, breathing child with a port in his chest and hospital wristbands still collecting on his nightstand. This wasn't just editorial recklessness. It was market-tested cruelty, and it had been bankrolled. $600,000 worth. Jasmine didn't speak for a moment. She let the words hang, corrosive and undeniable, before continuing in a tone stripped of everything but truth. This wasn't about outrage. It wasn't about telling hard stories. It was about triggering maximum engagement, high emotion, High shareability, because pain sells, and DJ Daniel was seen not as a boy, but as bait. She turned to the committee, and that transaction, backed by a political influence network, routed through shell media groups, buried under layers of consulting firms, was made to support a podcast that hadn't even aired an episode yet, but the script had already been written. The message had already been paid for. Jasmine paused again and looked down briefly, then back up, eyes razor sharp. It is important to say for the record that The Best People was never marketed as political, she continued. It was branded as a human interest series, a conversation podcast, a place, quote, where truth meets kindness. That was their slogan, where truth meets kindness. The chamber exhaled, but it was the breath of disbelief, the kind of breath one takes when watching a mask finally fall away. Then the cameras moved, not fast, not intrusive, but deliberately. They rotated slowly until they centered once more on Nicole Wallace's face, the same face that had once commanded Sunday panels, morning briefings, primetime specials. But now that face had changed. It wasn't simply pale, it was ashen. Her lips were parted slightly, caught somewhere between confusion and collapse. Her eyes didn't rise to the screen, nor to Jasmine. They flicked between her water bottle, her lap, and the blank surface of the desk, as if any one of them might offer a way out. But there was no way out. Her right hand reached instinctively toward her papers. Her fingers touched the corner, then withdrew. Not in hesitation, but in retreat. Her composure had become a thin film, visible but no longer intact. The woman who had once owned the narrative was now a passenger inside someone else's. One she hadn't written, one she couldn't spin. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She didn't reach for the mic, because there was nothing left to say. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't smirk. She simply folded her hands in front of her and said the quiet part out loud. You weren't reporting, Mrs. Wallace. You were executing a business model with a child in the crosshairs. And with that, the transfer, the email, and the mask were all officially documented, under oath, on screen, and across every platform in America. And as the damning financial records faded from the screen, $600,000 tied directly to a child suffering, his name turned into profit. No one in the room moved. There was no gasping now, no scribbled notes, no hurried whispers, only a collective stillness, as if the entire chamber was holding its breath for a verdict no court would need to pronounce. Jasmine Crockett didn't reach for more files. She didn't call another witness. Instead, she leaned forward, elbows on the desk, eyes fixed on the space between her and Nicole Wallace. Not looking at her, but through the architecture of power that had allowed this moment to exist in the first place. The weight of the evidence behind her, the eyes of a nation ahead. And then, finally, she spoke. Not like a politician, but like a woman with nothing left to prove. When someone with a microphone, Jasmine began, her voice low, steady, and slow like thunder gathering over a battlefield, uses a child, not to protect them, not to uplift them, but to harvest emotion and clicks, then journalism is no longer under threat from government censorship. Her words carved their way through the silence, each one building upon the next with deadly precision. It's not a politician muzzling the press. It's not a dictator burning books. It's something colder. She sat up straighter, her fingers laced in front of her, knuckles white. It's betrayal, and it doesn't come from the outside. A pause, brief but blinding. It comes from the person holding the mic. The statement cracked through the room like a whip, and yet it wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The words landed heavier because they came without fury, only clarity. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but everything else in the room seemed to fall. The illusion of moral high ground, the echo of media immunity, the myth that power cloaked in concern couldn't still be power weaponized. Jasmine held the gaze of the audience, of the lawmakers, of every screen still tuned in. She let the silence that followed speak just as loudly as her statement. She had peeled away the final defense, that the press, no matter how flawed, was somehow untouchable, that noble intention could mask intentional harm. But in that moment, there was no refuge left in mission statements or press credentials, because the truth was undeniable now. The story hadn't just been told, it had been sold, and a child had paid the price. And as Jasmine Crockett's final words settled like ash on a battlefield, it comes from the person holding the mic. The silence that followed wasn't just contemplative, it was surgical. No one moved. No one reached for a pen. Even the committee stenographer paused, hands hovering over the keyboard like they were afraid to puncture the air. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She turned slightly. No dramatics, no smirk, just cold, procedural force, and tapped her screen again. The chamber lights dimmed not by design, but because the power of what came next seemed to absorb the room's breath. The screen behind her flickered to life again, this time not with testimony, not with transfer receipts, but with data. Stark, clinical, unarguable. A digital line graph bloomed into view, plotted with timestamps and viewer metrics. The y-axis labeled engagement per minute, the x-axis labeled episode timeline, the best people. And there it was, a spike so steep it looked like a fault line tearing through the earth, dated April 15th, 2022. 3 words glowed beside it: DJ Daniel's segment, plus 422%. Jasmine didn't narrate it. She didn't need to. The numbers spoke in a language even the most loyal media defenders couldn't spin. One moment, one child, and a 4-fold increase in interaction. Shares, comments, downloads, ad reach. The monetization of trauma made manifest in pixels and precision. A boy with cancer turned into a commodity. No debate, no ambiguity, just math. The room remained paralyzed. But then the screen shifted again. No warning, no intro, no title card, just a video feed. A boy appeared. The boy, DJ Daniel. He was seated on a plain couch, a pillow tucked behind his lower back, a soft nasal cannula still fitted gently around his ears. His hair had thinned since the last public photo. The room was dim but warm. His mother could be seen in the background, standing silently by the hallway, arms crossed over her chest. The camera angle didn't wobble. The audio was crisp. It had been pre-recorded. But no one in that hearing room knew it was coming. And no one was ready for what he said. DJ looked straight into the lens. His eyes were tired but steady. His hands were folded in his lap. He spoke not like a victim, not like a symbol, but like a boy who had been forced to grow up faster than anyone ever should. "I don't really know what Miss Wallace was thinking," he said softly, "but I know what I was feeling." He paused. The silence that followed was louder than applause. "I was scared. I was confused. I didn't know how my name got on the news or why people were talking about me like I was going to die soon." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I'm trying to get better, that's all. I didn't ask to be on anyone's side. I didn't ask to be a message." And then he said it. "Please, just don't use my name to get attention. Don't use me for that. Please." That word, please, didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded like a child begging not for pity, but for permission to be invisible again, to be just a kid, not a weapon, not a warning, just DJ. The screen froze on his face, not edited, not captioned, just still. The silence afterward was absolute, a silence that didn't ask for reaction. It demanded accountability. Wallace didn't blink. She didn't move. She didn't look up. The posture of polished composure that had carried her through a career of controlled conversations collapsed. Her right hand rose an inch from the desk, then lowered again. Her fingers curled inward, like they were trying to grip something no longer there. And then slowly, she bowed her head. Not in thought, not in strategy, but in quiet, irreversible defeat. No one clapped. No one whispered. No one saved her. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to, because the moment had spoken for her, and the only sound left in that hearing room was the quiet, lingering echo of a boy who never asked to be brave, asking for something far more radical, to be left alone. And as the screen faded to black, DJ Daniel's plea still echoing through the room like a siren in the wreckage. No one could look away. The moment had passed, but its aftershock had only just begun. The silence in the chamber was no longer about restraint. It was the sound of a reputation collapsing in real time. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't gloat. She simply folded her hands, the calm architect of a reckoning that had written itself. And then, without warning, phones throughout the room began to light up. Tablets vibrated, earbuds buzzed in the ears of aides and journalists alike. Something was happening, not in the room, but around it. A digital rupture had begun, bleeding into the world beyond Capitol Hill. A young staffer from the media pool stood suddenly, whispering frantically into his headset. Seconds later, a CNN field producer nodded to her camera operator and raised one hand into the air, signaling breaking. The screen behind Jasmine flickered to life, this time not with prepared exhibits, but with a live news chyron, hastily dropped in mid-broadcast. Breaking. Apple, Spotify remove the best people from featured podcast listings following Capitol testimony. Below it, a live ticker scrolled in red. Search visibility disabled. Promotion contracts suspended. The words came like fire over dry timber. Wallace's podcast hadn't just lost favor, it had been erased. Across the platforms where it once sat atop curated staff picks and editor's choice, it now read, no longer available in featured rankings. And within minutes, the backlash spread further. Public forums flooded with screenshots of the removal, former subscribers voicing betrayal, influencers and critics from both political ends posting the same word, unforgivable. Wallace didn't react, not externally, but her hands, so still just minutes before, began to move. Small, nervous gestures, a twitch in her left index finger, a subtle rub of the thumbnail against her wedding ring. She was listening, she was absorbing, and the silence around her had begun to feel like isolation. Then the second shoe dropped. A White House communications staffer entered the chamber from the west door, handing a folded note to one of the senior Judiciary Committee members. The message was read, silently, before being passed to Jasmine. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't need to. The screen behind her updated once more, this time with a bold headline from Politico. White House cancels meeting with Nicole Wallace on public trust in media, citing incompatibility of values. The subtext screamed louder than any official press release. A conversation about ethics could not include someone who had just been nationally exposed for violating them. And for Wallace, that was more than a scheduling conflict. It was exile. Her entire identity, trusted media insider, political thought partner, cultural tastemaker, was now toxic currency. Her access, once automatic, was revoked. Her proximity to influence, now a liability. The seats she once filled were going cold, but the unraveling wasn't done. From the press box, a Bloomberg journalist raised her phone, quoting a new statement just released by Arcturus Equity Group, one of the podcast's largest financial backers. Her voice trembled with the weight of the quote as she read it aloud into the room. We invested in thought leadership. We do not fund the emotional manipulation of sick children. As of today, all support for Ms. Wallace's podcast is terminated. No spin, no ambiguity, just financial death in a single paragraph. On the screen, the official statement followed seconds later, complete with company letterhead and timestamp. The email bore the subject line, immediate withdrawal of partnership, irreconcilable ethical breach. Wallace's head dipped slightly, no longer defiant, no longer defensive, just lowered. She had survived thousands of interviews, hundreds of tough headlines. But not this. Not when the world outside the hearing was reacting in real time, stripping her legacy layer by layer. Her podcast was gone from the front page. Her White House access had been rescinded. Her funding had collapsed in public. And all she could do under the glow of institutional lighting, with 17 million people still watching, was sit. Not as a journalist, not as a host, not even as a victim, but as a symbol of what happens when trust is monetized and the voice holding the mic forgets who's listening. And as the final blow landed, sponsorships revoked, meetings canceled, her podcast scrubbed from every digital storefront, the silence surrounding Nicole Wallace had become weaponized. It wasn't the silence of suspense, it was the silence of distance, of people strategically backing away from something that could still explode. Nicole sat rigid, eyes fixed downward, while the hearing room's collective gaze shifted from pity to calculation. But the most brutal cut, the one she never saw coming, was already loading, not through testimony or exhibits, but from the outside world. And this time, it came from inside her own house. Phones lit up again. One, two, then a dozen. Staffers stared. Producers on the media balcony froze mid-whisper. It wasn't a leak, nor a political statement from the Hill. It was a tweet. A single surgical tweet from Rachel Maddow. Not just a fellow MSNBC anchor, not just a respected name, but Wallace's closest ideological peer, a woman who had dined with her, defended her, co-hosted crisis night panels with her through elections, impeachments, insurrections. And now, without warning, Maddow had drawn a clean, public line in digital concrete. I was wrong to stay silent. We cannot defend the weaponization of children for political storytelling, no matter who does it. That includes us. No hashtags, no emojis. Just truth, raw and unflinching. Like a resignation letter nailed to the front door of the cathedral they'd built together. Within 60 seconds, the tweet detonated across every screen in the chamber. Committee members' phones lit up in near unison. The press gallery broke into hushed chaos, half documenting, half gasping. Wallace didn't look, but the light from a nearby aide's iPad illuminated the unmistakable blue and white interface of Twitter, where her name had been trending for hours, now flanked by the phrase that would write her eulogy in media history: "Number MSNBC reckoning." Within 5 minutes, it was the #1 trend nationwide. Not manufactured, not algorithmically boosted, organic, relentless, viral with purpose. It wasn't just a cultural response. It was a call to audit the entire institution. Viewers who had once defended MSNBC through thick and thin now posted screenshots of their unsubscribes. Longtime liberal commentators shared the tweet with captions like, "Accountability begins at home." Even former producers chimed in, some cautiously, others defiantly. What had been a single fire had now become a coordinated demolition. And through it all, Wallace sat unmoving. She had survived political slander, false accusations, media witch hunts. But she had never survived abandonment. Not like this. Not from Rachel. Not from within. She tried to reach for the water again, missed, rested her palm on the desk instead. The veneer of control, the posture, the polish, the projection of calm was gone. She didn't cry. She didn't lash out. She didn't defend. Because what defense could outvoice the echo of that tweet? Rachel hadn't just distanced herself. She had rewritten the verdict. And in doing so, she made sure the public knew this wasn't just about one woman. It was about an entire network now forced to answer a question louder than any scandal. When the microphone is misused, how long before the silence becomes complicity? And as Rachel Maddow's words continued to ripple across every digital surface in the room, Nicole Wallace didn't lift her head. She didn't need to. She could feel the collapse tightening around her like a vice. This time, not from political adversaries, but from the very people who once stood beside her. Hashtags she had never feared now carried her name like a guilty fingerprint. The phrase MSNBC reckoning wasn't trending, it was triumphing. And yet even then, something deeper, something more final was still on its way. Because behind the scenes in offices above this very hearing, decisions had already been made. Jasmine Crockett knew it. So did the press. But the cameras and Wallace had yet to see what was coming. Without ceremony, the lights dimmed slightly. A tone chimed through the chamber's audio system, clear, corporate, unmistakable. Then the central screen behind Jasmine flared to life again. Not with documents or evidence, but with the live face of Robert Essler, chairman of MSNBC. The framing was precise. His background, matte blue with the network's logo blurred softly behind, reflected calm control. But his expression was taut, jaw clenched like someone delivering a eulogy in a boardroom. He didn't offer pleasantries, didn't introduce himself, just looked directly into the lens and said, "After internal review and in light of today's proceedings, MSNBC is hereby terminating its long-term advisory relationship with Nicole Wallace, effective immediately." A stunned stillness swept the room, but this time it came laced with something else. Release. No more speculation. No more internal spin. The network hadn't just distanced itself. It had cut the cord. On camera. In public. Under oath. Robert Essler continued, his tone clipped and practiced. We acknowledge the trust our viewers place in us and understand that credibility must be earned every day. Today, that credibility requires accountability. Our decision reflects our commitment to those values. And then the feed went black. No follow-up. No chance for rebuttal. Just termination. Executed with the same precision Wallace once wielded against her guests. Before the room could recalibrate, it happened. A voice rang out. Not from the dais, not from a journalist, but from the gallery. A man in his late 50s, dressed in a faded veteran's jacket, rose to his feet. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait to be recognized. He simply stood and shouted, "That should have happened last year." Gasps followed, not because of what he said, but because of how many agreed. Heads turned. Cameras shifted. A ripple of nods moved through the gallery like a current catching dry brush. Someone in the second row clapped once. Instinctive, not performative. Then immediately stopped, aware of the gravity. But the sound had been made. The seal had been broken. Wallace sat frozen, eyes now wide but unfocused. Her body didn't react to the outburst, but her face, drained of color, jaw slightly slack, made one thing devastatingly clear. She had expected this moment eventually. She just hadn't expected it here. The attention turned to Jasmine, and she didn't miss a beat. She didn't rise. She didn't lift her voice. She simply leaned forward, eyes calm, words exact, and delivered the final blow, not in rage, but with the force of history clearing its throat. Sometimes, she said, voice smooth like polished stone, silence is complicity. But today, truth holds the mic. The room didn't cheer. It didn't need to. The impact didn't call for applause. It called for acknowledgement. And what Jasmine had done in that moment was more than prosecution. It was exorcism. She had taken a platform once built to tell stories and reminded the world that when it's used to exploit the voiceless, it no longer deserves to exist unchallenged. Wallace didn't lift her head again, not to respond, not to defend, because there was nothing left to say. Her mic was off, and as Jasmine Crockett's final words, "Today, truth holds the mic," echoed across the chamber like the closing line of a verdict no court could overturn, the weight of the entire hearing seemed to descend upon Nicole Wallace's shoulders all at once. The room no longer looked at her as a commentator, a journalist, or even a political casualty. She was now something far more haunting, a monument to what happens when credibility is weaponized and conscience is outsourced. Slowly, mechanically, she gathered her papers, though there was nothing left to say, nothing left to defend. Her hands moved more out of ritual than necessity, as if completing a gesture she had performed 1,000 times on studio sets where the power was hers. But here under these lights, that familiarity had turned into futility. She stood up slowly, deliberately, and began her walk toward the exit. The cameras followed her like shadows made of glass. They didn't zoom. They hovered, smooth, clinical, unblinking, capturing not drama, but consequence. Her heels struck the marble in a rhythm that no longer sounded confident, but hollow. The exit sign glowed red at the end of the aisle, a cruel irony. The only light that offered her escape was one she didn't control. And then came the flash. Not one. Hundreds. A wall of lightning erupting as soon as she crossed the threshold of the press perimeter. Journalists didn't shout. No one barked questions. The silence had become its own kind of punishment, a rejection louder than any headline. She kept walking. Not once did she lift her head. But then, without warning, she passed him. He wasn't seated on the dais. He wasn't in a headline. He wasn't behind a microphone. He was in the aisle. DJ Daniel, the boy at the center of it all, the one whose name had been dragged across airwaves, commodified, distorted, and defended by people who never once asked him to speak. He had entered the hearing late, escorted quietly by his mother and a Capitol staffer, positioned respectfully in the second row, away from the spectacle. But now as Wallace walked past, the moment crystallized into something no scriptwriter could have staged. He stood. He didn't say a word. He didn't reach out. He simply stood, face pale but composed, and looked up at her, not with hatred, not with victory, but with something far heavier, disappointment. And Wallace could not meet his gaze. Her eyes flicked toward him for a breath, then fell instantly to the floor, like glass retreating from a flame. Her lips twitched, her throat tensed, but no apology came, no words at all. She moved past him like he was part of the marble, but DJ didn't sit down. Instead, with hands that trembled slightly, he reached into the front pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a folded piece of paper, crumpled, softened by repeated folding. Carefully, he made his way down the aisle, the room parting gently for him like the sea bowing to a deeper current. He stepped onto the carpeted incline toward the dais, where Jasmine still sat, silent, centered, watching it unfold with quiet, unspeakable gravity. When DJ reached her, he didn't speak immediately. He simply handed her the note, handwritten in blue ink, blocky and earnest. Jasmine unfolded it, reading as the cameras rolled, capturing every second. DJ's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but somehow it cut through the oxygen like a blade of sunlight through storm clouds. "Thank you for fighting for kids who don't get microphones." The room didn't move. A single tear rolled down Jasmine's cheek. She didn't wipe it away, because this moment, this boy, wasn't about optics. It wasn't a segment. It wasn't a rating spike. It was the one voice that had been used, stolen, repurposed, and finally, restored. And for the first time in hours, Nicole Wallace was no longer the focal point of the room. DJ Daniel was. And this time, he wasn't a story. He was the author. And as DJ Daniel's quiet, defiant moment with Jasmine came to an end, his note clutched tightly in her hand, his words still lingering in the air like the aftermath of a lightning strike, the room seemed to hold its breath, unsure whether to applaud or grieve. Jasmine turned back toward the dais, but she didn't sit. She stood there, hands steady, face unreadable. Then, without speaking, she gestured to the lead technician. One last clip, her eyes seemed to say. One more truth to honor before the curtain could fall. The technician nodded, and the lights dimmed for the final time. The screen behind the dais flared to life. Not in dramatic color, not with flashy graphics, but in soft, muted lighting. It was DJ Daniel again, but this time, he was seated in a simple studio, framed in a way that allowed no distractions. There were no Chiron banners, no scrolling hashtags, no performance polish. Just a boy, a survivor, a human being stripped of media packaging. His hoodie was zipped up halfway, his eyes clear and unwavering. There were visible bandage marks at the bend of one arm, where an IV had likely sat. His voice, when he began, was quiet, quieter than the previous clip. But what it lacked in volume, it carried in moral gravity. "She thought I was a gimmick," DJ said, not with spite, but with an exhaustion deeper than most adults would understand. "But I'm a real person. I have doctors, I have scars, I have bad days. Some days I can't walk without help. Some nights I throw up for hours after treatment." He paused, eyes blinking slowly. "But I still try to go to school. I still read comic books. I still laugh when my dog jumps on the couch, even when he's not supposed to. I'm not a message," he continued. "I'm not a segment. I'm not a number on a chart or a way to win an argument." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in truth. "I'm just trying to live." Then came the final line, the one that would sear itself into the country's conscience. "Thank you, Congress, for proving that I'm not a thing, I'm a someone." The screen went black. Not a fade, not a transition, just an abrupt, surgical stop, like the closing of a book that no one realized was nonfiction until the last page. The silence that followed wasn't stunned, it was stricken. Even the most cynical reporters in the press box sat with their heads lowered, thumbs still, phones forgotten. The collective weight of what had just been said, and who had said it, made even the room's marble columns seem suddenly fragile. Nicole Wallace, seated now in the far corner, didn't shift. She didn't raise her head. She didn't cry, but she seemed smaller. Not just defeated, dismantled. And then the outside world responded. Within 60 seconds of the clip ending, DJ Daniels' name was the #1 trending topic across every major social platform. But it wasn't just his name. Hashtags like number not a gimmick, number I am someone, and number truth has the mic ignited a wildfire across the digital landscape. The original video was posted to the official congressional streaming channel and reshared 3.2 million times in under 5 hours. On YouTube, the raw clip, without commentary, without overlays, gained 10 million views by nightfall. On TikTok, teens and veterans alike lip-synced to DJ's words. "She thought I was a gimmick," was mouthed against grainy emotional montages. But the digital fallout didn't stop at trending topics. It became consequence. By the following morning, Nicole Wallace had lost 1.2 million followers across Twitter, Instagram, and her podcast mailing list. By the 72-hour mark, that number had climbed to nearly 2 million, and that didn't include silent unsubs or the mass deletion of engagement from thousands who had once praised her as a truth teller. Verified users began unfollowing publicly, some with comments like, "I believed her, now I believe him." Even former guests on The Best People began issuing statements, distancing themselves from what had become a cultural reckoning in real time. Major platforms didn't wait to issue their response. Apple removed The Best People from their editors' picks and inspiration categories. Spotify delisted the show from both social justice and top political commentary. By the end of the week, the podcast, once a flagship of modern media activism, had disappeared from all algorithm-based homepage recommendations. Search functionality still worked, but only if you knew exactly what to look for. The silence was strategic. The erasure was deliberate. Media watchdog groups pounced. So did professors, students, and journalism guilds. DJ Daniels' clip was shown in freshman media ethics classes within 24 hours. Universities streamed the hearing replay in full. News programs, liberal and conservative alike, ran split-screen commentary, not debating if Wallace had gone too far, but asking how the industry let it happen at all. For Wallace, it was a collapse no PR team could reverse. But for the nation, it was something bigger. Because what had begun as a hearing about one voice had become a referendum on all of them. A searing, unfiltered confrontation between access and abuse, between influence and accountability. And in the wreckage of it all, one truth stood. This wasn't just about Nicole Wallace. It was about every institution that had forgotten what power was supposed to be for. It was about the journalists who had once promised to speak truth to power and had instead spoken on behalf of it, until that very truth came for them. It was about the producers, the bookers, the strategists, the panels who viewed human suffering as narrative fuel and trauma as leverage. It was about a boy who had fought to survive something that could kill him, and then had to survive being reduced to a rhetorical device on national television. It was about the microphone and who gets to hold it. And on that day, for the first time in a very long time, the microphone belonged not to power, but to someone it had once tried to erase. DJ Daniel, not a prop, not a pawn, a person, a survivor, a symbol, not of victimhood, but of vindication. And that hearing, once thought to be just another political spectacle, had become something else entirely, a national reckoning, not with politics, not with partisanship, but with the very question that echoed louder than any headline. If the press is free but unaccountable, what exactly is it free to do? And America answered, by listening. And as the echo of DJ Daniels' final words faded from millions of screens, what lingered wasn't silence, it was shame. Not the loud performative kind that fades when cameras cut, but the raw, aching realization of a nation forced to re-examine the stories it tells and the pain it profits from. This wasn't a political victory. There were no applause breaks, no confetti, just the deep collective stillness that comes when people finally see the cost of their indifference. And from that stillness, a reckoning began, not in courtrooms, not in studios, but in the conscience of a country. That was the moment Jasmine Crockett walked alone down the marble corridor, the hearing now behind her, the echoes of exposed truths still trailing in her wake. Her heels clicked, but not like a victor's, like someone carrying weight she didn't ask for. Journalists tried to speak to her. Cameramen flinched, unsure if they were capturing redemption or tragedy. She said nothing. The paper DJ gave her was folded in her palm, her grip tightening every time another flashbulb exploded in her face. To some, this was justice, but to her, it was heartbreak wearing the mask of accountability. And maybe that's what made it matter. Because in the weeks that followed, people didn't just talk about the scandal. They talked about the boy. They talked about the system that let his name be weaponized, about the silence that followed when it should have been rage, and about the line that had quietly been crossed in American media, where the truth wasn't something you earned, but something you edited. Across campuses, professors asked new questions. What does freedom of the press mean when it shields cruelty? Who holds the microphone, and who gets cut in post-production? In hospitals, young cancer patients were shown the clip of DJ Daniel not to inspire pity, but to teach resilience. He didn't just survive, one doctor told a class of interns. He reminded the world why some stories should never be treated as strategy. And in newsrooms, those temples of curated objectivity, reporters stared longer at their scripts. They paused before reducing someone to a label. Whisper networks emerged, quietly exposing other anchors, producers, hosts who had used pain as currency and children as spectacle. For every Wallace, there were others. Jasmine hadn't lit the match. She had simply refused to look away once the fire started. The deeper lesson, though, came not from Congress or commentary. It came from DJ himself, the boy who wasn't supposed to speak, the child some believed was too sick, too young, too uninformed to understand media manipulation, and yet it was his voice, steady, small, unflinching, that cut through America's noise like a scalpel. I'm not a message, I'm a someone. That single sentence now hung in classrooms. It appeared in national editorials. It was spray-painted on walls and quoted at rallies, not as a viral moment, but as a reminder. When we use children to fight ideological battles, we don't win. We fracture what's sacred. Still, not everyone learned. A popular cable panel tried to run a counter-segment, painting Jasmine as overly emotional and accusing her of using DJ as a prop herself. But within minutes, viewers turned off. Hashtags flooded in defense. Chak protect DJ, Chak Jasmine stood alone, Chak truth has no party. Even some conservative hosts, long at odds with Crockett politically, admitted on air. That wasn't a gotcha moment. That was a gut check moment. For a rare, fragile window in American life, the outrage paused, and reflection took its place. But Jasmine? She didn't rest. In the following days, she met with parents of other exploited minors, families whose children had been dragged into the media spotlight without consent, used as clickbait or campaign fodder. A mother of a school shooting survivor sobbed into Jasmine's shoulder, whispering, they edited out her tears to make her look aggressive. Jasmine didn't promise reform. She didn't offer platitudes. She just listened. And then she fought again. Legislation followed. The Protect Minor Voices Act was drafted in collaboration with child psychologists, ethics professors, and journalists with spotless records. It didn't seek to censor. It sought to shield, to create an ethical firewall between minor trauma and media ratings. And while some networks pushed back, claiming it infringed on press freedom, it was DJ Daniel who wrote the foreword to the bill's summary. You can still tell stories, he wrote. Just don't forget that the people in them are people. That sentence was read aloud on the House floor. And when it passed with bipartisan support, reporters didn't rush for sound bites. They turned their cameras quietly to the gallery, where DJ Daniel sat with his father, one hand on his IV port, the other gripping the same folded note he once gave Jasmine. The bill wasn't the end. It was the beginning of media introspection. Networks issued new guidelines on featuring children. Advocacy groups launched watchdogs to monitor real-time broadcasts for ethical violations. Even Wallace's former employer, MSNBC, released a formal apology, not just for the incident, but for the culture that allowed it. We mistook proximity for virtue, the statement read. And in doing so, we betrayed our own standards. But Jasmine never gloated. In every interview she gave afterward, she downplayed her role. This isn't about me, she said. It's about DJ. It's about truth. It's about not letting microphones become weapons. When asked if she felt the media could change, she paused, then simply replied, only if we remind them why it matters. And that was the final lesson. That truth, real truth, isn't loud. It's not manufactured in edit bays or sculpted into hashtags. It's quiet. It's inconvenient. And often it shows up in the form of a boy barely strong enough to stand, but brave enough to say, "Please don't use my name to get famous." America had looked away from those moments for too long. But now? Now it remembered, not because of outrage, but because someone finally chose to listen. And as the headlines slowly faded from the front page, Jasmine Crockett stood beneath the Capitol dome once more. This time not as an interrogator, but as a messenger. The cameras weren't rolling. The lights weren't staged. But what she carried now was heavier than any folder, more explosive than any leaked clip. She had seen a system that fed on pain. She had watched silence become policy. And she had looked directly into the eyes of a child forced to grow up too fast just to reclaim his name. She stepped to the podium at a press conference the media expected to be procedural. Just legislative follow-up, they assumed. But her voice didn't shake. It burned. "This isn't about ratings anymore," Jasmine said, eyes locked on the journalists present. "It's about responsibility. It's about every newsroom, every editor, every host who has ever looked at someone's trauma and asked, 'Will this trend?'" There were no gasps this time. Just guilt. Just gravity. Then she looked past the cameras and straight into the lens, speaking to the nation like a witness who refused to let the truth dissolve. If you're watching this and you think you're just an audience, you're not. You're part of the pipeline. Every time you click, share, or stay silent, you're voting for the kind of country we become. The room stilled again. So I'm asking you, demand better from your networks, from your elected officials, from yourself. Because the mic doesn't just belong to the loudest voice, it belongs to the most accountable. Her final words weren't written on a teleprompter. They came from the scars of the battle she'd just survived. Don't wait until it's your child on screen. Don't wait until your truth is edited for impact. Don't wait until freedom is nothing but noise. Stand. Now, while it still means something. And with that, she walked away. No applause, no music. Just the weight of truth still ringing in the silence she left behind. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.